Вообще не хочу уезжать из Крыма, из-за лучше. Как здесь классно.
Привыкла, да?
Я привыкла здесь, как в своем доме жили. Настолько все душевно. По-домашнему. That was a Russian family fleeing Crimea, and they're not the only ones doing it. An exodus has begun. Russians are leaving Crimea in droves. Take a look at this. Major traffic jams, cars lining up on the highway, and these videos have been posted by Russians themselves. What were they doing in Crimea? Holidaying. Russians come here for a summer holiday to experience what they call the Crimean Riviera. But now they're in a hurry to leave. And that's because the war has come to Crimea. Major blasts rocked the region yesterday. Today, satellite images showed destroyed Russian jets. This looks like a targeted strike. A series of bombings destroyed a Russian base in Crimea. Moscow says it was just an ammunition explosion. But now there is growing evidence that Ukraine carried out this assault. And Russia has launched a deadly counterattack. Russian forces have conducted rocket strikes, and that too near a nuclear power plant. 14 civilians have died in this operation. World leaders fear much worse, though, a nuclear disaster. The United Nations Security Council has called an emergency meeting. This is our cover story tonight. We'll start with Crimea. Today we got a closer look at the Russian base in Crimea thanks to some satellites in space. I have some pictures for you. This is what Russia's Saki air base looked like before the blast. There was a runway and multiple aircraft surrounded by green spaces. This is what Russia's airbase looked like before. And this is what it looks like now. The entire base has been flattened, presumably by bombs. Warplanes have been blown up. At least 7 Russian jets look completely destroyed. There are large craters in the area. The leader of Crimea has shared the scale of the damage. His name is Sergei Aksionovas. He's a pro-Russian leader. This is what he said.
Unfortunately, we have 14 injured and 1 dead. We express our condolences to the families and loved ones. We have 62 multi-story buildings damaged. The inspection of individual residences is now being completed. There will be information about the damages there within a couple of hours. The explosions have been declared an emergency situation of regional significance. The number of people in temporary accommodation facilities is 252. They are all being provided with food. All accommodation standards are being met.
So one person, in fact, has died, 14 are injured, 62 multi-story buildings are damaged, more than 250 people have been moved to shelters. Remember, Russia claimed the damage was minimal, but these pictures and statements contradict those claims. The Russian base has suffered extensive damage. A simple explosion would not have done this. This, like I said, was a targeted strike, one that was most likely launched by Ukraine. Now remember, Kiev refuses to take responsibility, at least on the record. But off the record, senior Ukrainian military officials are talking, and we have some details. They say Ukraine's special forces were involved in this operation, and they were not working alone. Local resistance fighters in Crimea joined them in this mission. They're called partisans. They're like a group of guerrilla fighters. And this wasn't their first joint operation. Increasingly, Ukraine's forces are working with them. But they're involved only for specific missions. What kind of missions? Like targeted attacks behind enemy lines. So where have these partisans struck before? One of their recent operations was in Kherson. This is a major economic center in South Ukraine, or it used to be at least. Now Russians control it. Ukraine has been trying to take it back. The partisans were involved in recent operations there. They targeted Russian bases and ammunition depots in Kherson. So that's the story of what happened in Crimea. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is raising the stakes. Yesterday he was talking about taking Crimea back. Today he's eyeing the Donbas region.
If almost 43,000 dead Russian soldiers do not convince the Russian command to find a way out of the war, then more fighting is needed, more results to convince them. Only yesterday the occupiers lost 10 aircrafts, 9 in Crimea and 1 in Zaporizhia region. The time will come when they will flee the Kharkiv region, Donbas, Crimea, and everyone who can help with that must do so.
Almost 6 months of war and a lot of lost territory later, it's hard to fathom where this confidence comes from. Sounds more like his final gambit, because Russia is not taking any of this lying low. It has upped the ante, and this time with a nuclear threat. Ukraine's Zaporizhia nuclear plant is under fire, and this plant is under Russian control. It has been since March. In recent weeks, this nuclear plant has seen multiple attacks. The latest one was yesterday. Russian forces fired rockets from here. Let me repeat that. The Russians fired rockets from a nuclear plant in Ukraine. Not one or two, but 80 rockets, 80. Their target was the town of Maranets. 14 civilians died in the strike. Residential neighborhoods, apartment blocks, and administrative buildings were all damaged. And this does not even begin to cover how serious the situation is. The constant firing around this nuclear plant is a matter of concern. And this isn't just any other plant. The Zaporizhia nuclear plant is the largest in Europe. It has around 500 Russian soldiers now. They've turned the plant into a military base. Ukraine has tried to take it back, and now they've come to blows here. The attacks and counterattacks are taking place extremely close to critical safety systems and very close to radioactive materials. Ukraine's nuclear power operator, Inahuatom, is afraid. It is warning of a hydrogen leak. In fact, I have a statement with me from this company. This is what it says. Ukraine is calling on the international community to take immediate measures to force Russia to release the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant and hand over the power plant to the control of Ukraine for the sake of the safety of the whole world. The G7 has responded to this SOS call. It has urged Russian forces to leave and to allow Ukraine to take control of the plant. Needless to say, Russia will not act on G7 demands or even the United Nations demands. Nonetheless, the UN Security Council has called an emergency meeting. Fun fact, guess who's the current president of the UNSC? China. Also, these forums are just to make dramatic statements, you could say. Both Russia and China have the veto power. So any hopes of de-escalation because of such meetings are weak. The fact is, as this war intensifies, the world faces a greater risk of nuclear disaster.